Hey everybody, welcome to today's video, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about game demands and particularly training for game demands. So it feeds into the specificity of your training and things that Jamie's spoken about before in terms of having a proper focus and relevant content when you train. So if you're training for speed, make sure that your session's designed for speed. If you're training for game demands, then you need to start with the end in mind and know what they actually are. And that's hopefully what I'm going to put across really quite quickly in this video for you. So as in some of my previous videos, I'm going to share just a very quick presentation with you today and talk through what game demands are. And it's, like I said, it's starting with the end in mind, knowing what's coming and preparing yourself for what's going to happen on the field. So typical game demands, okay, broken down by position. Here, front row, back row, inside backs including halves, and the back three. Average distances covered in an 80-minute game, meters per minute in the second column, and what percentage of that involvement is high intensity work. And we're going to show a definition of what a high intensity effort is kind of seen as, or defined at least in research terms, and how you might be able to apply some of those things to your own training. But hopefully what you can see here is that the positions and the meters covered aren't massive. These numbers are taken from international and elite competition. So depending on where and which team and what level you're playing at, they are going to vary, of course. But this is just to give you an idea and talk around some concepts with game demands. So specificity of your training has to be applied to what you need to do on a Saturday, and the intensity, the percentage of intensity work is relatively low, but the high intensity efforts are really, really hard work, and it's this appreciation of preparing for the worst case scenario. In terms of defensive demands, forwards make more tackles and are involved in more contact situations than backs. I'm sure that doesn't come as a great surprise. Between 11 and 22 tackles per game forwards, 10 to 16 for backs. And it brings us on to kind of the crux of the message for today's presentation is preparing for the worst case scenario. So a high intensity effort has been defined as 21 seconds of gameplay. I'm not sure why. I think this was based on game analysis, and I thought it was appropriate. And within that 21 seconds, 3 or more sprints, with or without tackles, with or without a scrum, ruck, maul. So it could be a high intensity effort would be just 3 tackles, 3 consecutive tackles, or 3 ruck or maul situations in very quick succession within that 21 seconds, or purely 3 sprint efforts within 21 seconds. That's one high intensity effort. And what a lot of coaches will talk about is repeating those high intensity efforts. So those 21 second windows with those game involvements, how many of those are you gonna have to do whilst you're on the field? And it varies greatly. Front row 15, back row 17, inside back 16, outside back 7. A lot of numbers. Don't get intimidated by them, and I hope it's not coming across as too researchy. The main point is that rugby is not a steady state event. It is bursts of very, very high intensity work with quite significant periods of recovery when you average it out over a game. But those key periods where you need to operate at your best is about moving from one high intensity event, recovering, going again, recovering, going again. And those longer periods of rest and recovery will come during the game, either through stoppages for injury, breakdowns for scrums, kicks into touch. The recovery will come. So looking at these, the max durations, you can see for the forwards, you can be working very, very, very high intensity for close to 3 minutes if you're in the back row. That I'm sure hopefully you'll appreciate that in terms of ruck and maul involvement, that makes sense. And then the outside backs, typically around a minute of high intensity with minimum recovery between 30 seconds and a minute minimum. So I've tried to keep this video relatively short, relatively punchy, and hopefully you've not been too bombarded with numbers. Take home messages, train for what you need to do. When you're planning conditioning drills, and this is what we do on the Rugby Renegade program, high intensity bouts should be a minimum of about 20 seconds. That's what we're working to class as a high intensity effort. These key game periods where you're giving it everything and you're in the red zone and you need to go high. Heart rate, adrenaline, input into the match. These are the kind of periods that determine success or failure on the field. And it's the ability to do them over and over and over again. 21 seconds, 3 sprints, 3 contacts, 3 ruck or maul involvements, or a combination of those. You can have a sprint into a contact scenario, into a maul scenario, into a sprint, and you can manipulate that so it's a bit more position sensitive. Preparing to work up those worst case scenario events, you know, up to a minute, 2 minutes, but using that repeated block within that when you start to increase the duration of your drills. Manipulate rest intervals. 20 seconds would be a worst case scenario rest interval, very, very short before you have to go again into a high intensity effort. And you can introduce rest periods of far longer than that. They do take place on the field, but obviously being time efficient in your training, you've got to be aware of that. Up to 3-4 minutes. And this doesn't have to be absolute static rest, standing, doing nothing. It could be low intensity skill exposure, handling drills, but have a focus and a purpose to each drill. And your session, like a game, should have these peaks of high intensity, lower intensity exposures and recovery. Take the intensity back up, bring it back down. It'll make it far more game relevant. It'll prepare you far better for what comes on game day. And the task for today is to go away and create 1 or 2 drills that use these principles that you can use for yourself in terms of the position that you play. Have a think yourself about what your skill demands are on game day, what high intensity scenarios you might be faced with, either offensively or defensively, and then come up with a drill that's going to prepare you to deal with those on game day. All right, guys. Any questions? As always, get them in the comments and we'll get back to you. Thanks. See you soon.